Hello, Peter here. Before we get into this episode with the amazing Paul Mcllroy, we had a few issues with some sound. So from about 9 minutes in to about 14 minutes in, there is a problem with the sound. You can still hear what Paul's saying, but it's not ideal. So we resolved that issue very quickly. And then after that, it's an amazing episode. So stay tuned, please, and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to the Health Oddity Podcast, episode 228. We are on the second week of 2025. And if you are listening on the day of release worldwide, like I know many of you do, it's the 10th of January. And we are joined by a very, very special guest for what will be his 6th visit onto the podcast. I think he's the only person who's done more visits to the podcast is Dan John, I think. And he's on about 10, I think. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But we did say before we started recording, this may end up being a double part episode, a part 1 and a part 2, because once we get talking and once this guest starts talking, it's great. We just get into a flow, and we've cleared our calendars for the rest of the day, and we're just gonna
3 hours later, we're talking about the pyramids and aliens and who built them. I'm only joking.
I actually listened to that when you did that with Paul.
Yeah. Listen, if you do a podcast with Paul Murray, it's definitely going to end up talking about aliens.
Excellent.
But it's interesting, you know. It was definitely a different one.
I keep seeing the videos of him in the forest with all his gongs and things now as well, and he's got his down bathing.
He's getting very into frequency. There's a lot to that. It looks kind of cookie, but there's a lot to it.
I know. I know.
Worthy of further investigation.
Yeah, excellent. So, well, anyway, you may have just heard him. You will have just heard him. We're joined from Belfast in Northern Ireland by Mr. Paul Mcllroy. Before we start, I will just say he's been on, like I say, 5 previous episodes. I'll quickly tell you, it was 22, Unleashing the Superhuman You. It was 53 and 54. The Mechanics of Strength, part 1 and part 2. And then it was 185 and 186, which was Mastering the Kettlebell Press and Building Pillars of Power. But he has not been on with us for about 9 months. And today we are going to be... So usually I'd say, go back and listen to all the previous podcasts that this person's done. But I think today we're going to be talking about... Paul's new book, relatively new book, called Perpetual Strength. And I'd probably say, because we're going to be talking about an overarching, his principle and his principles and his theory and his method of building strength that's in the book, Perpetual Strength. So I'd say if you haven't listened to any of the previous ones, don't worry too much. Listen to this one. But then if you like what you hear, and I'm sure you will, go back and listen to some of the other ones. So I'm holding up at the moment a copy of Perpetual Strength by Paul Mcllroy. And on the cover, it says, how to keep getting stronger year in, year out, using the art and science of comfort zone expansion. And the book is available from dragondoor.com. And by the time this goes out, I'm sure it will also be available in hard copy and ebook from Dragon Door and also from Amazon as well. But if you just type in Perpetual Strength, Paul Mcllroy, it will come up where you can buy the book. I've read it cover to cover. It's a really, really interesting book, and we're going to kind of talk about that with Paul today. So, yeah, how are you doing, Paul? Are you okay, mate?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you. That was a flawless introduction.
I've got some notes, I've been doing. It's gradually getting more polished as we go, isn't it, Pete?
Yeah.
That's why whenever I get I'm in touch with someone who might come on, James is like, do you want to do the intro? I'm like, no. So I'll just fluff it so you can do it now,
Okay.
You got it down to a fine art.
So I suppose, even though, and we will say straight off the bat, because we get new listeners every month, that Paul is both Pete and myself, or Pete and I, however you should say it. He's our coach, and I was looking, actually, I'm on training week 150
Wow.
with Paul, and I've been training for over. So Paul's been my coach for over 3 years. It was 3 years ago in November, just gone, that I started training with Paul. And Pete, you're similar or a bit longer, I think, aren't you?
I think I'm coming up to 2021.
Yeah.
It was after the first time you came on the podcast.
Yes, that's right.
And we had a chat afterwards, and I was like, "Can you coach me?"
Yeah.
So Paul is both of our coach. He coached to both of us, and has been for, like you hear, like between 3 and 4 years now. So I suppose really, but we've been aware of you obviously, and we spoke to you lots of times before. But this phrase, perpetual strength, I've not heard you use it before, and it's the title of the book. So maybe to start off with, where did that come from? I understand where it comes from and how it buys and how it ties in with your philosophy. But yeah, it's a lovely title for a book and it's a lovely phrase. Where did that come from?
Well, I'm going to have to credit the other people involved behind me as well. It was John DeCane, actually the CEO of Dragon Door Publications, who suggested that as the title. I think myself and Dwayne and a couple of others involved with me brainstormed a number of options for the book based on the premise of the book, based on the content within the book and the programs within the book and the ethos behind the programming in the book. And Perpetual and Strength were in some of the titles, but there was other things too, and they weren't together, I don't believe, just in that plain, punchy sort of 1-2 sort of combination. And John, in it, with his infinite wisdom in these areas, in that he's published some of the best sellers by Pavel Satsalin, Dan John, Marty Gallagher, Paul Wade, the list goes on and on and on. He was just like, what about Perpetual Strength? And he also came up, based on some of the paragraphs that I gave him to describe the book itself, he also came up with so I kind of have to mostly, it was a team effort, but I have to mostly give the credit of the actual construction of that down to John DeCane. Yeah, but it does encompass the training ethos of the book quite completely.
Yeah. And I suppose I've got some notes down in terms of the things that you talk about in the book. And I love the book, and I loved certainly what, for me, as someone who knows you and has been aware of your work for a long time, I kind of the book's almost, I think the first two, maybe I could separate it into 3/3 really. The first third is kind of like almost your story and your history and your background and lots of stories around growing up and your love of strength and training and things like that. And then I think the middle third is kind of almost like explaining your philosophy behind strength and why it works and the kind of the science behind it. And then the third, if you like, the final third is more like the programming aspects of it. And I loved it all. But for me, that kind of probably that middle third of really what it is, why it works, why it's different from other things out there, was it really just kind of, I was fascinated by it. And so maybe we can touch on a few kind of, not theories really, but where potentially modern wisdom and what most people talk about in terms of training, where your system and your philosophy kind of differs to that, why that works and why that is. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that you said quite early on is this idea of training to peak for something and then training to peak for something, and the phrase you use in there is cycling for a peak lowers the peak, and maybe just kind of this kind of idea of people training to constantly test their strength, training then test your strength, training then test your strength, and why outside of kind of maybe competition, why that's not a good idea. If you could maybe
well, first of all, the first thing that needs to be stated, I think, is that the theories that I have and the ethos, my training ethos, and as effective as it is, has only been made possible by what has come before me, if that makes any sense. I'm not trying to say I've reinvented the wheel. I have definitely purposefully stood on the shoulders of programming giants that have come before me. And if they didn't predate what I did, there wouldn't, well, it's not entirely clear to me what the impetus would have been for me to think along these lines. My programming ethos differs somewhat from what had come before me, but it's not entirely clear to me that there would have been what the impetus for me thinking along these lines would have been had what came before me not come in the first place. If that makes any sense. So yeah, it required. There's nothing wrong with strength cycling. Strength cycling or intensity cycling, i.e., weight cycling, load cycling, whatever name you want to put on it, is a highly effective method of acquiring strength. And in many ways, what I do is a form of intensity cycling. It just takes the emphasis off, as you pointed out initially, the sport-related focus of 6 to 12 week mesocycles, you know, which essentially sprung up around competitive sport initially. Periodization sprung up around competitive sport, and then intensity cycling, which is generally a periodization macro cycle, meaning like a year's worth of mesocycles in microcosm, getting to the point of maximum strength faster. Still, it's 6 to 12 week blocks, kind of sprung up around strength and power sports, right? Most notably Olympic weightlifting and powerlifting, and then later on professional strongman, different things, CrossFit even, right? But for everybody else, and potentially even for those guys, I don't see it as the most effective way to get stronger in the long term, because every time we peak, we sacrifice, we lose something, right? We have to sacrifice. You can't give that amount and not have it take something in return. And your central nervous system takes a big hit. And the stronger you get, the bigger the hit gets. And the older you get, the bigger the hit gets. And the bigger your muscles are, the bigger your hit gets, even regardless of strength. And you put all those things together, and you're older with big muscles, and you're very strong, and you're getting hit hard every time you peak. And it's not just a 1RM, but especially a 1RM. It can be in any rep max. It takes that toll on the central nervous system. You can even make a case for higher rep maxes taking more than a 1 rep max. Maybe not neurologically, but not far off neurologically and physiologically. A lot more, because of all fatigue metabolites and the extra recovery that has to happen in the soft tissue as a result breakdown. And for the general population, and potentially even for strength athletes who are looking at it in a very long-term way, one of the best, I think, a better way to strength cycle is to project it. If you look at or if it helps to view a intensity or strength cycle, mesocycle as a pyramid, right? Because the volume and the intensity follow that pattern, pyramid, inverse pyramid, right? So the volume starts off wide, big, or bigger than what's going to end up anyway, almost always. It depends on the program, but in almost all cases, classic intensity cycling starts off way, and the intensity is lower to allow for that to happen, because there's an inverse relationship that's unavoidable between volume and load.
Hello, welcome back. You may have noticed, I'm sure you did, we had a few sound issues with Paul's mic for the first few minutes. We have just resolved that. We're going to continue the conversation, and now everything is resolved. So back over to Mr. Paul McElroy. Okay.
Hopefully we've resolved it. It remains to be seen. It seems to be resolved. Okay, so yes, so intensity cycling is characterized by, it's best viewed as a little pyramid, right? Where volume and intensity share an inverse relationship, where the training cycle, which is typically somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks, most frequently 6 to 8 weeks for something like a powerlifting competition. Maybe there's several of these that strength athletes run throughout the year, every year of their career, so to speak. And the base of the pyramid is wide because there's relatively more volume almost always at the start of a intensity cycle than there is at the peak. And in order to allow for that to happen, the weight itself, or the intensity or the proximity to 1 rep maximum, is less, it's lower. Okay, and as time goes on, weight is added, volume drops, intensity increases, culminating in a 1 rep maximum, hopefully a new 1 rep maximum if it's done correctly, either in the gym for a planned test, or if it's a strength athlete, usually on the platform. Okay, so my approach is essentially a giant pyramid, right? Instead of a series of tiny pyramids, I just build the base wider and wider and wider. For a start, one of the reasons that intensity cycling works by building strength is that it starts a place that's comfortable. Okay, so it should be noted, if you've listened or read any of my previous stuff, you'll have heard me say this before in one form or another, but as you said at the start, if this is going to be your one-stop shop, then you might need a quick refresher course on what the whole ethos is in the first place. And, historically, better ideas in strength and hypertrophy programming are characterized, in my view, at least as I noticed, with increased periods of time in the training cycle dedicated to training in relative comfort, i.e. with reps in reserve, i.e. sub-maximally, i.e. not the failure to some extent, right? And a intensity cycle for a strength sport competition like powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting is characterized by starting very distal or very distant from failure, right? With a higher volume. In other words, doing less reps than you could with whatever percentage of 1 rep maximum you're working with. And it is most sub-maximal at the start. And as weight is added, you're trying to retain that sub-maximal status for as long as possible, up to and including the final workout, right, which may be as high as 95% or 90% anyway, where you still have at least 1 rep in reserve, maybe 2. And then, you're going and maxing out on the day, potentially, in the competition. And so the fact that this has consistently produced better results over the decades and decades of its existence points to, and also anatomical and physiological knowledge of how the central nervous system works, in that our muscles are capable of producing incredible force, but we are inhibited from doing this because it could be injurious. And if we were operating at our maximum capacity, let's say, we would literally break our bones with the power of our own muscles if we were fully innervated neurologically. So on some base level, it's clear to me, or at least it dawned on me at some point, that strength, excessive amounts of it for the sake of it, is viewed as a threat by the human body. And we're not trusted with it. It's like a toddler with an Uzi, which is something I mentioned at that workshop that you guys attended. And it is kind of akin to that. If you give someone who isn't ready for the amount of force that they can produce, the all-powerful nature of the full innervation of our muscle fibers, we would literally hurt ourselves with it in a similar manner to giving a knife to a toddler or a weapon of some sort. So our central nervous system, even though it is one with us and is us, most pragmatically speaking, in terms of being a strength athlete or just someone who strength trains, is most pragmatically viewed as a separate entity, even though it's not. right? So you view it as such for reasons of pragmatism, for reasons of function, and then it becomes obvious that the most effective strength training is that which does not trip the inhibitory switch too soon, and allows or convinces the central nervous system to allow the individual to exert higher levels of force over time, right? And when we amalgamate that theory with the decades of anecdotal and literal field studies, let's say, of literally millions of people at this point strength cycling, and we see that they are spending increased time training sub-maximally, and that's a more effective way of getting stronger rather than going to failure frequently, then it becomes obvious that increased time spent training in comfort is very highly correlated, maybe on a one-for-one basis, with the central nervous system's tendency to allow us to exert more force. So if that is the case, and it appears to be, then the logical evolution, in my opinion, on strength cycling is to make the cycle bigger, right? To focus on that base, because the wider you can make the base, the higher the peak of the pyramid has to be, regardless of what else you're going to do. The only thing left, everything that remains to be done at that point is to bring it to that peak whenever you want and or need to. But until then, an ever-expanding base, which is much easier on the central nervous system, especially if training submaximally, an ever-expanding base is way easier to progress and improve in than constantly trying to force a peak and telling your nervous system, something scurry's happening in 3 weeks. Like, we're so adaptive. We're such an adaptive organism, right? That, it doesn't take long. It doesn't take many strength cycles, right, for a genetically typical, drug-free, natural individual, especially one who's no longer neophyte to training and who's no longer in their 20s or something like that, right? It does not take long for the central nervous system to start saying no to the productivity of most short-term strength cycles, right? Other ways we'd be in a world full of Eddie Halls, and we're just not. As a matter of fact, something else that we touched on in the workshop that time in Belfast, we're in a world full of eternal intermediates. People who reach as to within the 90th centile is as strong as they're ever going to be within the first 3 years of their training, maybe 5 at the most. And then it's 10, 15, 20 years of undulating between a bit less than that, about that, maybe slightly more, way less because they get bored and stop. That's unfortunately the story for most people's strength training. And it appeared to me that a much better way and a much more fun and easy way is to just keep expanding that base and let the peak of the pyramid take care of itself. So that's kind of what comfort zone expansion is. The trick is how to do it.
So, go on. Sorry, Pete, you go.
I was going to say what you've just said there at the end is I've got loads to say now, but that bit at the end is what the way I saw it. And then I come across what you were doing and all that sort of stuff. But it's like, yeah, people tend to be where they are, the what did you call it? The perpetual intermediate. And,
yes.
And it's kind of like the over time that curve comes down because you're here and then you get injured because you're trying too hard. And then you drop. And then the next thing you try to get to is back to where you were, but you get injured on the way to there. And then, so what happens over time is the curve actually comes down rather than what I've experienced with your training is it actually goes in the opposite direction. Yeah.
When you're told that that's your fault, you're told it's your genetics, you're told, blame your parents, oh, hey, pick your parents carefully. Yes, genetics matter massively. In fact, outside of programming, nothing matters more, right? Really. assuming all other things are generally equal, and someone's going to eat. For example, eating and drinking water is probably, breathing air is probably the most important if you want to break it right down. But assuming somebody's going to breathe, drink water, and eat something, genetics are the most important thing, but you can't control them. But you can control programming. And the good news is that's the next most important thing. And it's very important, and you're told that because you're genetically typical, that means that you've got to remain at a plateau that's 10 years long. And that might sound far-fetched, right? But gentlemen, we're old enough, all of us, men in our 40s, men in our mid-40s and beyond. That's you, Pete. You're beyond.
I'm late. I'm well and truly in my late 40s now.
I'm only joking.
I'm closer to
James
50.
are in the mid-40s.
Well, you youngins don't know what you're doing.
Well, you've got the satisfaction of knowing that you look 10 years younger, you son of a beehutch. But
genetics.
Yeah, he takes that hat off and he's got a hairline of a Spartan as well. I hate him. Look at that. Look at the hair he's got. Unreal. Look at the hair he's got. Anyway, where was I? Yes, you're told that this is your lot and that it's your fault. And that, 10 years, a 10-year plateau sounds like I'm being far-fetched. But we do know better. We know better at this point. Us three, we know better. And if you've been training for, if you're in your 40s and you've been messing around with weight since your teens or 20s, which describes most people, right? Then it's true. It's true. What is even serious strength trainers, like a lot of people I train are Strong First certified individuals, fantastic organization. Was the CEO of Strong First Ireland for 10 years, so I believe in the system. And I'm constantly training people for those certifications and things like the Beast Tamer Challenge, right? But there's guys who've been in that system, in CrossFit, and 20 different things, powerlifters, this and that, strongmen, who've been plateaued for a decade. Like when was the last time you broke your 10 rep max in the bench press or the kettlebell press or the turkey's get up or anything like that? Your 1 rep max on the pull up. How long has that been your max? Your 5 rep max, your 1 rep? In almost every case, it's been far too long, right? And it's because programming is suboptimal, right? The nervous system. One thing that strength cycling has given us is the clue that we need to spend a projected percentage of our time training in relative comfort in order to, for want of a better word, it's not really a trick, but facilitate the central nervous system into allowing us to use more force. It's given me that, and it's given us all that, and we should all be eternally grateful for that. But where I think it's kind of potentially suboptimal in its current and most popular, most prolific form, is that it's too much for a rush to then bring you to your 1 rep maximum. It's almost like the fast food of strength training, right? You want the Michelin star 5-course, 6-course meal because that delayed gratification is going to lead to a better result in the end.
It's interesting because we had Pavlo Cordiaca on, who's current kind of world's strongest man competitor, one of the top pro strongmen in the world from Ukraine, and I asked him, we were having a conversation about his strength training, and I asked him what his 1 rep max was in the deadlift, and it was really nice because he said, I don't know. He said, I haven't done a 1 rep max for ages. I don't train for it. All the competitions usually now are how many repetitions can you do with a certain weight. It's not the most weight you can lift for 1 rep. So they don't train to failure or train to a 1 rep max. We had Lucy Underdown on, who just recently broke the women's deadlift record of 325 kilos in the deadlift. And she could have done more, but she held the record. I think it was 318 and she did 325 and it went up. It looked like a kind of an RPE of about 8, I suppose. Wasn't even, wasn't shaking. The central nervous system wasn't, but she didn't fail. She thought, okay, leave it there. So what is it, do you think? Because there is a kind of, and I know from myself speaking personally, I follow your programming, but every now and then there's this little nagging thing in your mind. I wonder if I could lift that now. I wonder, there's that kind of thing of wanting to go back. And one of the quotes from your book that I wrote down was, "You'll never lift a weight you can't lift by trying to lift it." But there is that kind of, like the other week I did some heavier deadlifts, which were off program, but it's almost like, I wonder how much stronger I am now, and there's this. And I think
I've got a way around that, I think, and Paul might disagree, but every now and then I'll pick up something that is heavier than what I'm using and just see how many reps I can do comfortably without going to anywhere near failure. So like the 36 is my half body weight bell, right? And what I've learned as well within all of this is it's not even just the programming for like the press. It's per arm as well, because my left got injured years ago. So we were back on the 20 with the left when I was using a 34 on the right, and then we brought it all back together. And I recently did eight with a 36 on the left and then on the right. And the right was easy, but the left was a bit harder. But I got 8. And I wanted to get 10, but I knew if I went for 10, that would be it, like for a week or 2. So I got 8, and I was like, right, that'll do. And then carried on with the training. So yeah, like you were saying, that kind of takes a bit more out of your central nervous system, but it didn't take like it all out for me. So I was like,
yes. Well, tell you what, you've touched on. I'm going to say 2 things. I'm going to give you 2 separate answers, and I'm going to answer James's question because it's actually all different. But well, we'll start with James. We're human. We're human, right? It's particularly bad with men, right? I don't mean the stereotype, but when I'm training women, they're better at sticking to the program. it almost always, it's like, right, okay, there must be something connected to high testosterone forms the morphology of the brain during adolescence that just makes us eternally want to try and beat ourselves and beat other people and be the biggest and the best and the biggest and that. There's just something there's something innately true about that. That it happens to our brains during adolescence. Like, we're still obsessed. You've got He-Man in the background. I've got a collection of Marvel figurines over there sitting on a shelf. Castle Grayskull's over there. Yeah, my kids play with them. Yeah, but I kind of still like them. still like looking at it. We become obsessed with more from a very early age, and it's bigger is always better and stronger is always this. So no matter how much the logical side of our brain understands that we shouldn't be doing something, it's more of a fight against ourselves than it is a fight against what we need. Right, it's what we want versus what we need, and I'm as susceptible to it potentially more so, ironically, than most people, because I have an absolute obsession with being the strongest I can possibly be. And in my heart, even though it's not physically possible, especially natural from a man my size, but I still want to be the strongest human being that's ever walked the face of the planet. It's never going to happen, right? But my every waking breath will be, other than what I have to do for my everyday life and the things that are more important now, like my children and my family. But when it comes to the stuff I want to do for me, like, that's all I want. So it's a constant fight between what you need and what you know and what you want. And that's more a psychological thing than it is physiological. And what Pete touched on was it is actually fine. So there's 2 things. You can go heavier as long as the proximity to failure is approximately the same, relatively speaking, or as long as there's something left, and you do that infrequently. I'll say there's 3 things. So there's that. There's also, you can kind of max out every now and again on something related but very different. For example, a barbell military press with 2 arms. If you've been training the kettlebell single arm press a lot, and you'll often find that because it's so similar, we're going to say it, gents, we're going to say it, the rising tide raises all ships. Do you know, there it is. That's the first one. Might not be the last, but boom. Right? But it's true, right? It's a similar movement pattern. It's the exact same muscle groups. It's slightly different. It's different enough so that a slightly more maximal or even maximal test infrequently on something different enough kind of steals that wool, right? Like something you've done recently is you've had a bit of a go on deadlift variations as opposed to the deadlift, which we mainly train the deadlift. Okay. And people do a heavier kettlebell but not go to failure. So that's coming at the same issue from two different points of view. A third thing which is interesting, which occurs in the Amazing 12 program, which is probably the thing that I'm most well known for, or in the past I'm most well known for, is what I like to call tethering failure. Tethering failure by surrounding it in comfort, right? Right. Now, when almost everything is sub-maximal, but on one exercise on the final set, you're having a go, right? That can be very productive, right? So there's a part of the Amazing 12 program where you're supersetting two exercises. Let's say it's chest. There's actually 12 different programs inside the Amazing 12 program, and that's not actually by design that there's 12 and it's called the Amazing 12. It just happens to be 12. It's massively coincidental. But anyway, they're different programmatic progression patterns. And they're different for the different exercises. They're different for different experience levels within the same exercise, right? So beginner, intermediate, advanced type people get different stuff for different exercises, and the different exercises get different programs. So for one of the exercises in the chest and back program, it's a low incline dumbbell press and a horizontal bodyweight row on gymnastics rings or TRX rings. You can even use a bar, right? Doesn't matter. The first four, it's supersets between those two exercises, and the first four sets are sub-maximal, right? So depending on which part of the program that is, it's either 4 sets of 10 or somewhere between 4 sets of 5 and 4 sets of 10, right? So it's 4 sets of 10 for a long time until the first kind of mini peak happens. And then we start a new cycle if that needs be. It usually happens with very strong people. We come into the program strong, and then we're now cycling reps as well as load in a very specific way. But the fifth set is either a near max or a max, right, on both. But because literally every other exercise is sub-maximal, apart from this, and because the sets before it were sub-maximal, the taxing nature on the central nervous system is quite low, right? And you will be able to progress weight and load on the exercise the next time, right? Or make the same weight for the same volume feel easier next time, because on that fifth set, you're going to go way beyond whatever the rep quota was. It's going to always be distal in nature to where the rep total on the first 4 sets were, right? And because of that, the only thing that's going to happen is that failure set is going to get closer to the other sets over time in terms of volume. Failure is going to come at a lower point, but it's always going to remain distal relative to the 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st set, right? And so therefore, it's been you're gleaning the, because there is some very real growth stimulus benefits to going to failure. It's probably the most stimulative of muscle growth, most powerful stimulator of muscle growth in existence. But the paradox is, it's also the least effective way to grow muscle, if that's all you do, right? But you can glean its benefits if you have it represented in there and tethered around, surrounded by comfort, right? Because as the bottom end gets heavier, it actually pushes the top end up, right? And as it becomes ever more proximal to the other preceding 4 sets of 10, they'll eventually collide, and that 5th set of 10 will be a 10 RM, at which point we're probably going to, depending on the individual, we're probably going to go to something like 4 sets of 5 and start rep cycling again, right? And what's that going to do to the top set of 10, by the way? It's going to push it up.
Yeah.
Because you have less fatigue, even though it's heavier. Because it's only slightly heavier. Right? And so you don't even have to make it heavier. You can keep it at the same load because that was a peak 5 sets of 10 RM. Right? And if you can make that easier by the time you get back to 5 sets of 10, that 5th set has a chance of being a 12. Now you can make it heavier. Do you understand? So you've gotten this mesocycle that's lasted weeks and weeks. And you're already lifting heavier on this exercise than what you would have been had you maxed out on day one. And then you've extended it further by tweaking it to make it more comfortable. You've made what I like to call a grand gesture to the central nervous system of peace, right? Even though there's still a war going on with that last set. So it's beautiful, right? But if all you're doing is training to failure, it's ironically the worst thing you could be doing, in my opinion, not only in my opinion, but in the way it's been played out throughout strength history for both strength and hypertrophy. I can talk about that if you want as well. It's actually...
Yeah, because I was going to say, I've made one thing I was going to say from, so certainly I've changed a lot because whereas previously, like certainly when I was a teenager in my 20s or whatever, and I think it's one of your sayings, or I've heard you say before, if you're looking to find your limit, you'll always find it, or if you're searching for your limit, you'll find it. So if I was deadlifting and I just kept adding weight to the bar till I couldn't lift it, then but when I did the deadlifts, I think it was last week or earlier this week, last week, I kind of did a few sets of 5, a lot heavier, and then I built up and I did a set of 3, which was miles more than I'd ever done. But I stopped there. It wasn't like I've got to find where my 1 rep max is. It was like, well, that was a 3, and it was quite
that
good.
3 you could have done 5, I think.
Yeah, and
that's 3 you could have done 5 with it.
And when I watched it back, and I thought, but yeah, we'll leave it there because it's much higher, So, but one of the things I wrote down was around this proximity to failure, and you've mentioned it already, like reps in reserve that lots of people talk about at the moment, and it was the proximity to failure for strength and or hypertrophy. And I think, like you said, actually building strength from reading the book and from understanding, building strength, you're best off avoiding failure, as almost always. But like you said, but hypertrophy is slightly different. But although failure is a potent stimulus for hypertrophy as a strategy for as a repeatable strategy, it's not good. But maybe we can talk around that a little bit, like you said.
Yes. Well, this is probably the biggest thing. This is probably the biggest rock for people to get in their head. It's maybe one of the biggest aha moments that you'll receive if you fully take it on board. So first off, before I get straight into that, it always bemuses and confuses me in equal measure when the same people who would scoff, which is almost everybody with any degree of reasonable bodybuilding and or strength sport, either accomplishment or experience, would scoff at somebody coming into the gym every week and maxing out the 1 rep max and expecting to add weight every week to their already existing limit, right? Almost everybody outside of complete beginners will go nowhere very fast with that and will go backwards real quick. And the stronger and more experienced you are, the faster that's going to happen. It'll happen from the second workout, and it'll not be a small drop. It'll maybe be 20% if you're very strong. Do you know? Like if Eddie Hall tried to deadlift 501 kilos the next week, he would have potentially injured himself with 450. Do you know, like that's literally, maybe less than that. Like that's literally how big. Do you know, it could be 400, which would be a 20% drop for him. Do you know, so that's the reality. But the same people, which is almost everyone with any sense, who would scoff at that, habitually come in every week and try to do an extra rep with their 10 RM or add weight to a 6 RM or a 5 RM, like a true even 12 RM, right? The more experienced you are and the stronger you are, the more futile and the more potentially damaging that becomes. Because we know that beginners and, even certain intermediates might not be judging their 10 RM accurately. It's really a 12 RM and they're able to do it for a while. But, the more accurate you are on that, the less productive that practice is going to be. And yet it's widespread, right? So, by the time you get that 10th rep, describe a 1 rep maximum. It's coming off, you're trying to move it fast, but it's moving slow. It's coming to a sticking point, but it just about makes through it. Your limbs start to shake potentially. Everything, your head's starting to pop off and you just about get it locked out, and you definitely could not do one more. The 10th rep of a 10 RM is the same, because at that point, what has transpired beforehand has manifested in that 10th rep may as well be a 1 rep max at that point. Right now, neurologically, it's not perceived in exactly the same way because it's not as heavy, but it's still 75% in most cases of 10 RM, depending on fiber type distribution. So it's 3/4 of your 1 rep maximum anyway, and you're doing 10 times the volume with it in not much longer of a time period. Because how long does it take to do 10 reps? And you're trying to improve it every week by adding weight to it or trying to do an extra rep. It's almost, not quite, but almost as futile as coming in and trying to do a 2 rep max with your 1 rep max every week, or trying to add 5 pounds to your 1 rep max every week. Everybody would agree that that is futile, but almost everyone is doing the other thing with impunity and doesn't get that that's not the best way to go about it. Unless you are a beginner, your ability to keep training to failure every week and making linear progression in load is directly proportional to several factors, most notably of which is your training age or your training experience, how long you've been training. The greater your training age, the less you're going to be able to do that, the less it's going to work, the shorter your productivity is going to be by training to failure every week. Your genetics, your gender, your chronological age, your biological age, your muscle fiber type, your hormone production, your general genetics, and your drug-free status or otherwise, right? So if you've got a beginner who's juiced, who's a male, who's in his 20s, who's got great genetics, is loaded full of fast-twitch muscle fibers, is highly motivated and is a bit of a psycho, he can go to failure potentially for a few years more and keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And if he plateaus, he can increase the dose of his chemicals. He can do a number of things to keep progressing that load upwards. But for almost everybody else, everywhere, we've got the eternal intermediate, right? And that's just the way it goes, right? And one of the examples I give in the book prolifically throughout isn't actually one of the programs in the book, but it's actually quite a decent program. And it's the saga of lifter A versus lifter B, which I'm sure you've read more than once, right? And in its most basic and briefest of Cliff Note iteration, let's say you've got 2 genetic clones and they're both taking 75% of their 1 rep max, which for most people is a 10 RM. And the only thing that's going to change is what they do with it in the gym. And one guy does 3 sets to failure, which on a good day turns out to be 10, a set of 10 on a good day, and then maybe a 7, and then maybe a 5 or something like that, right? Or whatever, right? It's going to end up in the early 20s. Let's say even does 8 and then 7, right? And he takes it to 25 reps, which is, I believe, is the example I give in the book, which is the one I just said, 7 and then 5. Your experience is probably closer to the truth, as long as your rest periods aren't too projected, right? So that's 25 reps total with 75% of your 1 RM. And he's perceived every single set as a 10 out of 10. That's 2. He's went to failure, right? But the next guy takes the same load with the same ability and does 20 sets of 3 with it. So the first set is a 3 out of 10. It was a 30% effort relative to what he was capable of in that moment, which was 10 reps, right? So unless he's an absolute idiot and is literally trying to do like a circuit and he takes reasonable rest periods, even by the 20th set, that wouldn't have claimed much more than a 5. 6 at the most out of 10. to do that 3, at the most 5, right? Do you know who's going to be in a better position to add volume? A or B? It's B. 8 days a week, twice on a Sunday, right? Literally, if he wants twice on a Sunday, right? Because it's way easier to increase something that is more distal to your max than your max itself. I mean, that's the most obvious statement in the world, but it needs to be made, right? So if we rejoin these people in a few months' time, B could and very well might be at 20 sets of 6, right? So he started off doing 60 reps, right? Which is 2.4 times the volume of 25, right? And now he's doing 4.8 times the volume several weeks down the line with the same load. So he can add load, especially if it's a small amount, and make the grand gesture to his central nervous system of trust by decreasing the volume. There's a number of ways he can do that. He can keep the number of reps the same and decrease the sets, or he can keep the number of sets the same and decrease the reps. There's loads of things he can do which vary in terms of its level of comfort gesture, right? But the big thing is he can keep doing that for longer periods of time, for very long periods of time. A is maxed out from day one. He's unlikely to still even be training if he's not injured or ill at this point. Meanwhile, B, who's his genetic clone, a year down the line could be doing 20 sets of 3 with something that was 10 kilos heavier, 15 kilos heavier. Sounds like slow progress, but where's A? Nowhere. Probably weaker than he once was, stopped training. And that's the fate of the eternal intermediate. So you've got this choice, you know, and, you know, the biggest epiphany that comes from that is not that B is both bigger now for sure, because that's a huge volume with a significant percentage of 1RM, which has got heavier over time. And we know that the most reliable, well, muscle growth can be stimulated in a number of ways, right? With either volume or load, but the ideal scenario is to be able to increase load within the volumes that are most closely associated with muscular hypertrophy, which is medium to higher volumes of work in terms of both reps per set and total sets per workout, per microcycle, per mesocycle, per macrocycle, right? So B is bigger for sure. He's doing 20 sets of 6 with a heavier weight than this guy. 4.8 times the volume with a heavier load. He is bigger. He's also way stronger. And the real kicker is that he is not bigger and stronger in spite of not a single set producing as much individual growth stimulus as a single set of A. But because of it, that's the kicker, right? Every single set that A did produced more growth stimulus in microcosm than any individual set of B. But B is way bigger and stronger, not in spite of that, but because of it. He's bigger because not a single one of his sets produced as much individual growth stimulus. That is the paradox. But that
right, I'll tell you what, we are going to end part 1 there because that is perfect. And we're going to roll straight into part 2 because I've got questions. Yeah, go on, Pete.
The beginning of part 2 or the end of part 1 there for me is, and we say this all the time, what does it look like in 20 years?
Yes.
Because you can get bigger and stronger this week, but what will it do to you as you get older? You know, like you see it in athletes, don't you, who are knackered when, like, you know, and athletes push themselves, right? And that's like, you know, that's how it works, doesn't it? You give yourself up to the whatever it is you're competing in for a lot of people, like the Olympics and all that sort of stuff. But what does it look like in 20 years? And for most people, you want to still be moving, you know. So and quite handily in the book, I think, as well, but definitely in the handout you gave us, you gave us a 20-year program. You went, there you go. Just do that for the next 20 years and you'll be sorted. It was like, Brilliant.
Yeah.
Right,
know.
so we will. Right, we're gonna break there, and then we're gonna come back for part 2. So we will see you next week for episode 229 with Paul McElroy, which will continue in our world in about 10 seconds time. But we'll see you next week. Bye bye.